has happened?
I think the things that have emerged as ever, as more detail comes out, the Embraer aircraft he was flying in, there were lots of reports. There was a second aircraft around in the skies that Russia claimed landed straight away back at Moscow afterwards. But flight records show that that second aircraft actually continued on to St. Petersburg, turned around and then came back to Moscow later. Quite why Russia would lie about that or there'll be any discrepancies, who knows. In terms of the actual video footage, I think the main thing that comes out is that it's pretty evident this was not a minor incident or an accident. This is not something, it was fair weather. There were smoke plumes that lead directly to the implication that it was some form of missile, either ground launched or air launched. And if you look at the various, it looks almost certainly as one of the wings came off the aircraft before it hit the ground. They found the wreckage that was burning, but quite separate to that was one of the wings on the ground. All of that implies that either somebody had been busy with spanners, and that's not really realistic, or what's happened is a radar-guided missile has hit the confluence of the wing section and the main aircraft structure, and that would have been enough to blow the wing off, and then the aircraft would have just fallen like a sycamore leaf to the ground.
I mean, it really did. I mean, it plummeted from the sky, and it was, vaguely reminiscent of another bit of video I've seen, Dom.
Yeah, it was very similar to what we saw during that day, that extraordinary day when Yevgeny Prigozhin started sending his Wagner forces to march on Moscow. On the way, they shot down a Russian plane, and it looked almost exactly the same as what we saw yesterday. It was a same similar sized plane. It just fell out the sky, plummeted to the ground, and exploded in a fiery inferno. And the message may have been, if Putin was behind this, which seems most likely, that if you live by the sword or by the missile, you will die by the missile. And that kind of grisly symmetry, that way of killing to make it look like something we've seen in the past, is something that you could say is from the Putin playbook.
I mean, Sean, look, I don't want to play kind of devil's advocate here, but given what we have seen, given that on that plane was Wagner's number 1 and 2, and given the fact that Putin has got form for killing people that he's fallen out with, it is not an unfair presumption, is it, that this was operated, directed in some form by those either at the top of the Russian government or very close to it?
I think the comment by President Biden this morning was very illuminating. He said very little goes on within Russia without Putin having a hand on it. I think the surprise for most of us, we discussed this morning, was just that this hasn't happened sooner. I think many of us predicted that within 2 or 3 months of Prigozhin's ill-fated march on Moscow, that eventually he would meet his demise. And the only surprise really was how long it took. And I think most likely that was because President Putin did not want to make a martyr of Prigozhin. The two pillars that support him was his business interests as an oligarch. They've gradually been dismantled over the last few weeks. The Wagner forces, which at their peak were 50,000 strong, gradually some of them have been assimilated into the Ministry of Defence. Some of them have been sent off to Africa. Some of them are isolated in Belarus. Nobody's paying for them. And literally 2 or 3 days ago, we saw that picture of Yevgeny Prigozhin alone, apparently in Africa, touting for business, but the business he was touting for was exactly the same business that the Russian MOD is already offering an alternative. He was so alone, both physically and metaphorically, and that almost certainly signed the end of his time.
I mean, Dom, just remind us exactly what happened 2 months ago, because it does seem an awful long time ago, but there was a point when people were talking seriously about a coup attempt, trying to unseat Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, I was in Dnipro in Ukraine that day. The night before, I sort of crowbarred myself away from my Twitter feed. Couldn't believe what I was seeing that Prigozhin was saying. Woke up the next day thinking, what's happening? And I think we thought at the dawn of the day that possibly we were about to witness a Russian revolution because Yevgeny Prigozhin, he had taken control of the Russian military headquarters in Rostov-on-Don. He seemed to be sending his Wagner forces north towards Moscow. And that was off the back of a period where he'd been ranting and raving, getting more and more angry about the way the Russian military leadership was running the war. Not so much about Putin, but saying you've got to get rid of these guys. And he said, send them down to Rostov-on-Don so I can meet them. When they didn't get sent, he then sent his forces north. And then I think the best interpretation is that he just didn't seem to gather the support he wanted to. So as they approached Moscow, they got pretty close. He called it off, persuaded possibly by Belarusian dictator Lukashenko. For whatever reasons, he decided not to go all the way. Now, that may have been a miscalculation, as it turns out. That might have been his best
miscalculation, yeah.
It might have been his best chance of surviving, but it would have been a pretty tall order trying to take Moscow.
This was going to be my point. I mean, genuinely, a man like Yevgeny Prigozhin is clearly not daft. marching on Moscow with the goal of getting rid of the defence minister and the chief of defence staff. I mean, seriously, what planet was he on that he thought that this had any chance of success?
Yeah, I think he may have been deluded about the kind of support he could expect. He may have simply have been absolutely furious and acting impulsively. It's one of those mysteries, I think. I'm not sure we're entirely ever going to be clear why he launched this coup. But certainly by the afternoon, by the evening, there was no chance really of taking Moscow. That the support, if he had been hoping for, had not materialised. I was in a bar in Dnipro by the end of the day, and the Ukrainians I've been with who were daring to be jubilant, thinking they're about to see Russians killing Russians, were just utterly downcast and very depressed by the end of the day because this moment had passed. It wasn't extraordinary. I think it's hard to believe it happened now, but it then unleashed a series of events which has ended in this spectacular apparent assassination in the skies over Moscow yesterday.
So who then has the skill set? Who then has the necessaries to carry out an operation like this? And did it take 2 months for the planning of it?
Almost certainly not. I mean, it's not a difficult task to bring down a civilian aircraft if you've got missile systems. And Russia, despite its woeful showing, its Russian Air Force over the skies of Ukraine, where it's lost over 10% of its military aircraft. So it is not a difficult task to take out civilian aircraft. Most civilian aircraft don't have the defensive aids. They don't have an early warning system. They don't have electronic countermeasures available like flares and chaff available. So almost certainly the aircraft would never have known it was coming. And because every civilian aircraft has to file a flight plan before it goes flying, they would all most certainly have known exactly where, exactly when they were going to conduct this attack. So it wouldn't have been a great surprise to the military.
I think what Putin was more worried about was 2 months ago, he just didn't feel confident that he could launch that kind of... He couldn't take Prigozhin out. He wasn't confident that he had kind of neutered his organisation. And in the 2 months that we've seen, as you were saying earlier, Sean, we've seen Wagner being sort of dismantled, undermined around the world, in particular in Africa. Now, in Africa, Wagner, I mean, it's a network of... It's not really a kind of corporate entity as such. It's not like the kind of Western security organisations that we know. It's a network of criminals, gangsters, ex-soldiers. And in Africa, it's been very successful and lucrative by saying to African governments, if you don't want to go the Western way, come to us, we'll give you the muscle to stay in power, but in return, we want concessions for diamonds and other minerals.
You've got to say that they're blooming effective at it.
Yeah, it's a simple equation, a proposition that they made to African leaders, which is you don't want to follow the Washington playbook, you don't want to play by the rules, we will give you the muscle to stay in power, but in return we want diamond concessions, mineral concessions, and they got very rich at it. But ultimately got too big for their boots. And what we've seen in the last couple of months is the Russian military intelligence agency, the GRU, going to these leaders and saying it's not Prigozhin anymore, it's not Wagner, we're the guys in town, deal with us, which has undermined Wagner hugely. What
on earth was he doing, travelling around the world and getting on a plane then? I mean, surely if he saw this was going on, he must have known that there was a risk to his life.
I think that's one of the big mysteries of the last couple of months. Did Prigozhin really believe that he was not a marked man? Was he lulled into a full sense of security? We saw that extraordinary exchange between Diana Magnay, our Moscow correspondent, and Lukashenko, where Lukashenko said, you know, I can say with some confidence that, to use a vernacular, Prigozhin is not about to be whacked. That might have been reassuring to Prigozhin, but ultimately he would have been pretty deluded. We heard, I think, the night of the attempted coup, Putin saying that this was treason. He's never tolerated traitors, and there was no reason for Yevgeny Prigozhin to believe that he would be an exception to that rule.
I think there's also a point here that we have to look at Wagner in the round. It's a relatively new organisation, and its influence around the world, particularly Africa, has been very beneficial, not only to Wagner, but also to Putin himself. And arguably, when the battle wasn't going well in Ukraine, and President Putin said, I need help. Remember the battle for Bakhmut. He did not want to put more and more soldiers into the meat grinder that was Bakhmut. But he was very happy to let Wagner come in, recruit people from convicts who were probably more expendable to at least the Russian domestic audience. And he prevailed. And all of a sudden, he was delivering on the battlefield when the Russian MOD could not. That suddenly seems to be the culmination of his power when he suddenly became a bit too confident and arrogant, believed that Putin was utterly dependent on him, not only for foreign business, but also for winning the battle. And that seems to be the arrogance that has carried him through to make some really dodgy decisions.
Really briefly, if you can, is it possible that someone other than Vladimir Putin ordered this? Or is it indeed possible that Yevgeny Prigozhin is off on a desert island somewhere in disguise?
I mean, that's the thing. I think the mystery, the mystique of Prigozhin will continue because there is that possibility. It's an extraordinary story and it's straight out of a film script. But, you know, no one had the means and the motive to do this apart from Putin. If it wasn't Putin, it would have to have been someone outside Russia because, you know, as Biden said, this could only have happened in Russia with Putin's approval, and it can't have been the Ukrainians. They wouldn't have had the motive or the means, and it's hard to imagine anyone else would have wanted to do it.
And very briefly, the whole idea that he's still alive wearing a wig somewhere on a Caribbean island, if he was ever discovered, and these worlds of a connected world, he would be discovered. Just imagine the damage that would do to Putin's reputation. There's no chance at all that he's been allowed to survive this.
Sean, Dom, pause there. Coming up after the break, we will be discussing what this means for the war in Ukraine and indeed for Vladimir Putin's hold on power.